headquarters of common sense.
Talk Radio.
Jamie, a very good afternoon to you. So here we are. We're potentially approaching the end of many of these COVID restrictions, and I think most people accepting that we're into the sort of the endemic phase of COVID as opposed to pandemic. Inevitably, of course, lots of people, scientists who seem to enjoy lockdowns, they're whinging and whining, I think more in the background. Give us a sense of some of the latest critical data that may have been helping the Prime Minister and his closest advisors to give them the confidence about that on matters like excess deaths and things.
Yeah, afternoon, Richard. I think Boris obviously said in the week if the data continues to look positive, that he would bring forward that date in terms of easing restrictions. So let's actually look at the data itself. So Omicron came across the country around the middle of December, and then we saw that huge rise in cases. But as they were predicting in South Africa, because they were a bit ahead of us, that as fast as it went up in South Africa, it came down as well. And that's kind of what we've seen in the UK. But there have been a couple of things with the testing. There's been some changes in the testing protocol, which is part of the reason why some of the cases have come down. But I think we've got to stop looking at the cases and look at what you've talked about, which is kind of the death figures, and not just COVID deaths, all deaths. So the latest figures from ONS, and we've seen a similar pattern throughout most of January, Rich, is that we had 12,401 deaths registered in the last week. And actually, that's lower than what we had in 2018, 2017, and 2015. We saw a huge surge last winter, obviously, when we had that big second wave. But the current number of deaths across the country is lower than some of the years pre-pandemic. Part of the reason for that might be because we saw significant numbers of elderly people dying over the pandemic who may have been dying kind of now. But when you start looking at all-cause mortality, there's no real emergency with the numbers like we saw in the previous waves.
So we're sort of into 5-year averages plus or minus is what you're saying. And that's across the whole of the UK, not just England.
So that's the England and Wales figures, and you get a similar picture when you look at Scotland and Northern Ireland as well. And before you get to the kind of the death figures, you generally would see looking at the critical care bed. So I've actually been crunching some of the numbers this morning on this, and we talked briefly on this last time I was on with you, Richard, and then we've got now the full month of January's data in, and actually that paints a really important picture as well. So last winter, where we had a huge surge, we had to put more beds into the NHS for critical care because the number of patients in critical care last winter in January was kind of 75% above what you would expect to see in a normal winter. So quite clear, last winter we had a problem. Now this winter, with the Omicron variant, and I've seen lots of broadcasters talking about how many people are in critical care beds, and there's been a lot of discussion around people who are vaccinated, unvaccinated, and the like, and people filming from these things. If you actually start looking at the facts and figures, Richard, it's a really interesting picture there. We've actually got fewer patients over the last month this winter in critical care beds than what we've seen in 3 of the 4 winters before the pandemic started. So if you were looking at the stats, you wouldn't even think there's a pandemic at all in the country at the moment. If you're looking at
that's extraordinary, Jamie. I mean, funny that, isn't it? If you actually look at the data, look at the stats, you find out that actually, again, give or take, this is another normal winter. And yet some of these supposed experts on SAGE and in various universities, they're continuing to bang on that there is a crisis out there, but the data just simply doesn't support their position.
No, and Rich, when we went into the kind of Christmas period, there was talk for Boris to bring in further restrictions beyond the plan B that he brought in just before Christmas, with the SAGE modelers saying it could be around 2,890 deaths a day in the middle of January. We've got figures now from the ONS, which are kind of the gold standard, rather than just looking at deaths with a positive test. You can look at people who've died where COVID was put on the death certificate, and rather than 2,890, it was fewer than 200. So they were 93% out. And the previous modelling that they were doing was false as well. So the problem you get is if they're starting to come out, and I've heard people saying, are SAGE backing Boris? Well, basically, I think the SAGE credibility is probably shot now because the numbers that they've been coming up with in the past haven't been borne out. And the best thing about this one, Rich, is that because Boris didn't bring the restrictions in, you can actually mark the homework, because normally if they bring restrictions in, they'll say, oh, well, that's because the restrictions came in. So the SAGE modelling has been completely way out, and say the facts and figures are quite reassuring that we're probably now going into this endemic phase.
And of course, you've got the live example comparing England compared to what's gone on in Wales, where you are, where Drakeford, I think, has been rather exposed in the last 6 or 7 weeks.
No, indeed. So if you look at the pandemic from the start all the way through to the end of December now, because we get monthly figures from ONS, and remember, you get different parts of the country, you've got different age demographics, so you might find different deaths. So they've adjusted for all of that. England got hit first, and kind of especially London, we didn't have any warning, I suppose, so much about the first part of the pandemic. And England had a higher death rate than Wales in the first part of the pandemic. But remember, restrictions that were then kind of devolved from the summer of 2020, and Mark Drakeford took in more of the powers and this. And over the last 3 or 4 months, we've actually seen higher death rates in Wales, even though the restrictions have been more severe. So when you look at it in the whole, Richard, there's been no difference in the death rate between England and Wales, despite Wales having more restrictions. And actually over the last few months, probably because we didn't get so many deaths at the start, there've actually been more deaths when you adjust them for different age demographics.
And is that the same in Scotland as well, that broad picture, Jamie?
Though Scotland actually comes out much lower, and I think it's in part to do with the fact that the virus does what the virus does, and it goes around and spreads around the country. Scotland actually had a lower death rate overall, but then if you compare Wales to Scotland, they've had pretty much the same kind of restrictions. So when you start comparing lots of different countries, the restrictions themselves, you don't see a clear pattern that having more restrictions meant that you would have fewer deaths overall.
Well, essentially, that was the conclusion of the Johns Hopkins University report from the US, wasn't it? That actually, when they compared restrictions, different types of lockdowns or no lockdowns across different countries, that the difference was so small it was essentially unmeasurable.
No, and I would say we've learned a lot over the last 18 months. I think the only purpose really is this, where you would bring those restrictions is if you think the health system's going to be overwhelmed to the fact that people who really need treatment can't get it. We never got to that position in the UK. Maybe that's because of some of the restrictions early on. But if you're looking at the thing we were talking about today in terms of easing the restrictions, well, the facts are there. The NHS is no different to a normal winter now. So why would you continue with restrictions, especially as we're going into the spring? We've got to come out of this at some point. And the date is pretty reassuring. And if Boris is following that, which he says he is, I see no reason why he couldn't go ahead in a couple of weeks and start taking the restrictions out.
That sounds really good news, Jamie, that actually Boris has said he's going to look at the data after the recess. What you're saying is that you think the data will confirm the position that we should ease all the restrictions, and then actually Wales and Scotland should follow suit. Jamie, thank you so much.
Good talk.
Hot talk. Bold talk. Talk radio.
Listen on your smart speaker.
Watch it live on your smart TV.
The world headquarters of common sense.
Talk Radio.